The first step to get started with your portrait is starting with simple shapes and then proportions. So remember to block in the lines for the eyes, nose, and lips, lightly outline where the hair will be, and then once you have all of these facial features just blocked in with circles and simple shapes, you'll need to double check proportions and angles. So I'm using the eye as the measurement, checking the distance between the eyes on the outside of the face, and then from the top of the forehead, how many eyes fit from the top of that forehead down to the chin, down to the nose, just double checking the width and length of all of the different parts of the face before I begin to add detail. So super important to double check those proportions. And then I'm also holding my pencil up to my reference picture to check the angles of the jawline, the angles of the hair, and all of the other larger lines and angles in the reference picture, and then comparing them to the lines and angles that I have in my drawing, and just double checking and adjusting from there. Next, I'm lightly outlining all areas of highlight and shadow very, very lightly so I can begin to add a light block of value into it as I go. I'm outlining and starting to shade in those darkest shadows, so looking at the hair and different areas on the face. And then every once in a while throughout this time lapse here, I'm flipping the reference picture and my drawing upside down just to get a different angle and perspective of what I'm working with, as there should be different areas that jump out right away that need adjusted when you do flip the reference picture. And again, I'm blocking in those darkest areas of value. I'm holding my pencil way back on the end of the pencil and shading with the side of the lead versus the tip or the point of the pencil. So that's going to help me to really block in these values a lot more smoothly as I'm working with that side of the pencil. I also want to point out that I'm not staying in one spot while I'm shading. I'm doing this light coat throughout the entire portrait and not just focused on adding detail to one area. If you add a lot of detail to one area, you might later on realize that something's off and have to erase all of that detail that you added. By blocking in the darkest shadows first, I'm able to really look at larger shapes and forms versus small details. So that's going to help you to draw what's actually there versus taking a guess at what you think is there. So really take your time blocking in those values. And you'll notice as I go that I do kind of move around the hairline, the jawline, and just really try to perfect those angles as I'm working and as I'm refining highlights and shadows. Remember too not to create harsh outlines. You want to place your shading or use your shading to create the outline between areas of the nose, the lips, and the hair. So instead of having harsh outlines, I'm creating a dark shadow and placing that next to a highlight or a lighter area. And that's going to create the outline for you. So you'll notice, for example, with the side of the nose, I don't have a dark, harsh line from the eyebrow down to the tip of the nose. I'm using a shadow to create that edge. And as you're working on each facial feature, remember from practice how we have things blocked in with the different areas of value. For the nose, for example, we have the center plane, which is the lightest, and then there's the second and third plane as well that will be slightly darker, and then the darkest shadowed plane. So look at areas in those larger sections of highlight and shadow. Try to pick out the shapes as you go, and continue to really build those layers of value as you clean up areas, add detail, and refine them. So I'm just continuing to add more layers, starting to fade and blend those darkest values into more medium tones throughout the portrait. So remember to always be looking at a value scale and your reference picture. Find those areas that are the darkest, find the medium tones, and make sure that you're fading those dark values into your medium tones as you're working. With the hair, instead of starting with fine details and lines, I'm blocking in highlights and shadows, and then the last step that I'm starting to do now with the hair is refining it with adding those smaller textures and fine hair details on top. So save that for last. Start with shading the dark values, adding those highlights into it. You'll also notice I'm using that kneaded eraser in the hair a lot and really throughout the face. So kneadable eraser is great to create those fine little highlights as you're adding details and refining the portrait. In the hair, I did use that eraser a lot just to erase out those highlights. And then I shaded over top of the highlights with the finer details and smaller bits of hair. And on the lips, I'm erasing the fine little highlights. Look at those highlights around the outside of the lip. Look at where the shadows are and the value of the lips compared to the skin, making sure that it's either darker or lighter, depending on the lighting in your reference picture and the skin tone of whoever you are drawing. I'm really working on looking at the hair, how there's that little bit of shadow underneath it that is on the face. So make sure that you are really paying attention to those little nuanced highlights and shadows that will make all the difference in creating dimension on your portrait. And the last few steps here are just really refining details. So I added a few small fine hairs on the eyebrows, really looking at eyelash details, and then touching up the hair, making sure that I have that little bit of texture on top of it. So here's the finished product. You'll notice there's areas of highlight, shadow, and the medium tones throughout the entire portrait.